The topic of correlation between nationalism and democracy is becoming more and more widespread, and this is caused by the political events of the past years when under the slogan of nationalist revival or under the populist slogans, we have seen forces ascend to power which were quite removed from the liberal agenda. And from this standpoint, the problem of nationalism and the problem of democracy and how they correlate, is it possible for them to coexist? These points are all very material. And what I will try to do is to turn to several scenarios. But I also think that it is more important to state some questions, even though we may not find the answers. And many of you, as people of creative mind, will be able to probably judge for yourselves if these questions are raised and posited. Let me start with globalization. We have already spoken about globalization, how it is perceived in different parts of the world. We have spoken about the reactions. And what I would like to turn to is that globalization has been and will continue to be perceived as some threat to many societies where which have been perceived as somewhat threatening, and these societies feeling themselves in danger because of globalization. And whoever speaks on behalf of political circles, whoever deliberates or critiques globalization, it is a lot more frequent to hear that it is not globalization that has removed something from us, but something that it is bringing things which are not pleasant. When Mr. Trump himself says that globalization has taken away many jobs from America, but a lot more enthusiastic he was when talking about the migration. It's not about the jobs leaving from America for Asia Pacific, but the fact that a lot of migrants arrive in the U.S., which create problems for the American citizens. So the problem of immigration was probably more hotly debated during the electoral campaign in the United States than even the question of the loss of jobs before of globalization. So globalization today, and I think that it is great difference for globalization and why it is so painful, is that the globalization years ago was more economic and oriented from Europe into the other parts of the world. Today's globalization is a lot more cultural, immigration-based, and these are more centripetal and not centrifugal movement. And if we look at the history of the European continent for the past 500 years, then we shall see that over the first 450 years of these 500, this was the history of European emigration primarily. We have seen it on the example of North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, elsewhere. And this is because we have seen that these have been as the coevals moving and people emigrating from Europe, and not because these continents were taking these principles, but because they were absorbing so many Europeans. And we have seen how, say, Australia and Canada are different from Kenya, because in one case we've seen military conquest, in Kenya we've seen military conquest, and in, say, Australia and Canada we've seen colonization. This process is now reverted, and this process is becoming more and more intense. And today's nationalism, as different from the nationalism of the 19th century, is, in my view, the defense type nationalism. In the 19th century, under the flag of nationalism, we saw wide-scale expansion. We saw the rise of imperialist movement, an attempt to safeguard the model of domineering, whereas today the nationalists are primarily expressing the attempt to limit the influence of external actors, cultures, and peoples on the European identity. And today we don't see, as the British, French, or other identities are being on the defense. So, today's nationalism is about belonging. And while these nations have been formed over hundreds of years, the question is about belonging, as I already as we have talked about this politics of participation, who are the subjects of such a participation. And what we have seen is populism. And I don't particularly like the term of populism, because over many centuries, democracy or liberal democracy was developing in somewhat greenhouse conditions. Because originally the liberal ideas, when they developed at the time of overcoming the feudal order, these were the ideals of the justice and the law, and they took a lot of time to pierce through to the core of the society. And while the societies were becoming more and more solidarized or expressed solidarity with the rule of law state, democracy always had the danger of slipping towards populism. Daniel Bell, great American sociologist, whom I have had the honor to know for 15 years, has said on many occasions that he doesn't trust in democracy, but he trusts into freedoms and rights. Democracies are good when the democracy is coupled with freedom, the rights and responsibility of those who are taking or responsible for the democratic decisions. That is why Farid Zakaria was very conclusive about writing about the expansion of the democratic field. In the beginning of the 20th century, only several percent of the population of the European countries had the voting rights, and the actual universal suffrage only ensued towards the end of the first quarter of the 20th century. And in Europe, we see how it coincided with the system of absolutist system of Eurocentrism. So when we speak about nationalism and democracy, we have to take into account that today, in the centers of European civilization, we have seen a very difficult situation to emerge, which is harboring three processes, which is the democratic participation, which, as I said, was not primarily the aim of the first liberal thinkers. Secondly, the openness of borders and the openness of these societies, whereby two fundamentally different things are being coupled, the human rights and the citizens' rights. Under the French Revolution, when the revolutionaries were adopting the Declaration of the Rights of Citizen, these rights were viewed in conjunction or as one. Now they are perceived differently, whereas the human rights are a global tenet or a global doctrine. The citizens' rights are, take it or leave it, limited to different societies. So we can hardly say that some rights are subjugated to the other rights. This is indeed important in terms of the liberal institutions. And the third circumstance, which is also very important in this context, is that democracy could not have developed into populism until it really encompassed the entire society. So in the 19th century, there could be no populism because democracy was qualified. So my approach is that society, and I won't say nations, although nation state is in the Western literature is somewhat coinciding notions, but we have the right to define the boundaries of the permissible, to talk on behalf of the majority, which of course, and in this sense, I think the main challenge for democracy is the question about the extent to which modern democracy may be implemented with the erosion of state borders. And I think that this question will continue to become more and more harsh in different countries, because what we see and hear about human rights today, about multicultural identities, are in a way, like it or not, undermining the rights of the societies to organize their lives as they wish to. And I think this is the fundamental conflict which we're seeing today between democratic principles, between the open economies and the traditional values. In other words, democracy as the right of the majority may lead us to forget about the theory whereby we can see the positioning as of such a democratic system to defend the minorities. And indeed, in this sense, the recent presidential campaign in the United States was exactly the majority on the side of the Trump, and the totality of different minorities on the side of the Democrats. And the supporters of the Democratic Party yet again believed that the totality of minorities may prevail over the majority. But in this case, this did not materialize, because the victory of Mr. Trump in this case is a positive moment or a positive stimulus which should make sober those who were talking on behalf of the totality of minorities. And in this very case, we're seeing and maybe seeing the stimuli to have developed. Because an idea about reliance on human rights is, in my view, for the political process, a democratic thing, for the sheer reason that when we speak about human rights, we speak about them in a very expansive way. And I agree entirely that human rights for life, a right to freedom from torture, right to freedom of speech are the ideal rights that have to be respected. But when we say that people are equal and that these rights have to be provided, and if we talk about all people on the planet Earth, then the question arises: who should be providing these rights? And we, in this sense, we have to understand that there have to be special institutions, and indeed, it appears that the rights are quite universal, but the institutions are still state-based. So. In this sense, the human rights can only be respected insofar as there are these national institutions, and if the UN has military forces which will have the right for positive interference and military action in every place in the world where there are atrocities, then of course this would be an attempt to materialize such a principle. But if we say that human rights can only be respected and in different measures in different countries, as say the right of a Syrian to live in France or to get social security in France, then we are bound for a major conflict. Secondly, human rights, in my view, must only be limited to those which deal with personal security and dignity. But I do not see any reasons whatsoever why such rights should or must be taken over to the economic sphere. And when we speak today that why the immigrants are arriving in Europe, this was a proper question to ask. Because why? Because the social conditions are better in Europe. Creating good social conditions is the responsibility of a government. But indeed, then I do not understand why such goods or services may be availed of by those who come from elsewhere. And in this sense, I think, is the fundamental conflict and the main core statement of the European nationalists who stand against this dimension of globalization. And the longer we see this process whereby such human rights are, in my view, wrongly extrapolated to the economic sphere, the more and the deeper this conflict will become. So I think that an idea of a nationalist or national society or a more closed society is not in direct contradiction to the idea of democracy, in my view. No government in Europe today is trying to act in an undemocratic way, at least in the major things. And this is one of the basic questions. And any society, in my view, and this is what the nationalists often say, is that they should have the freedom to a society in the English language, Société, Gesellschaft, in French and German respectively, are in excellent harmony with the idea of society as a community and at the same time a company, because in this sense a society is based on some agreements, contracts, and the willingness and readiness to take certain principles. And I think that there are no universal principles that could be applied to such societies. And I think the more such principles are implemented, the more problems liberalism would have. The reason being is that a liberal approach is primarily oriented towards certain freedoms and rights, but these freedoms and rights have to be coupled with responsibilities. And when you look at the Declaration of the Human Rights, then there is no such thing as responsibility or liability. And rights and freedoms in their totality only exist within the national borders. And so, frankly, I do not see in a conclusive way the contradiction between nationalism and democracy. I personally don't. Nationalism is expressed in two ways. One is the nationalism of the small states or the small countries which have rivaled and vied to leave from the jurisdiction of the empires, which is an anti-imperial sentiment and which is still quite relevant today. Because any empire is a lot more reactionary today than any nation state. And so when we speak about attempts of secession, be it anti-colonial struggle in the periphery parts of the world in the 1950s, or attempts to secede from the Soviet Union, or else the attempts to move away from the imperial structures in Georgia, I regard these in a very loyal way. Why? Because I think that every nation, every people should be given the ability and the right to secede and the right to self-autonomy. But this pertains only to those nations and peoples which do not have a national state, a nation state, national borders. And for this very reason, the case of Abkhazia and Ossetia are generally reasonable. The case of Crimea is quite different because in that case Russia had its national state, and if the people wanted to leave or to exit the Ukrainian jurisdiction, it could have well moved into Russia. So the self-determination in this particular case is of no consequence. And when the peoples go above and over their national boundaries, it is they may move and can move to something more lofty, which has been shown on the example of the European project, when the nations may find it too narrow a space to materialize or implement their ambitious plans.
This way, I would say, I fully support the idea of integration within the EU because it gives people further chances and opens up new rights. The problem is that this unification at a certain stage, integration should come into a single European civic nation and one single European state. It happens both politically and socially. If you look at the history of the EU, back in the 1960s, I give this example very often, the number of marriages between citizens of various countries was 0.6%. In the early 60s, it was almost 6%. In 2 or 3 generations, we can be saying that they're starting to form a European nation, which may later lead to changes in the statehood. And this is an objective, normal process. As Lenin said, before we come together, we need first to divide. It has happened in Europe and is happening. Where it hasn't happened yet, it is bound to happen. Wrapping up, sorry. Oh yes, one more point I wish to make. I would like to repeat again that liberal society in Europe arose only when and where they predetermined division into smaller states and quasi-state structures of the Middle Ages, and they came up with modern nations in the way we know them today. The nations became the field for liberal experiments and liberal policy and democracy. I do not feel that if Germany and other parts of Europe if it had remained disunited, as it were, in the Roman times, we would have seen coalitions there. As to further, as to nationalism and its fate in Europe and Russia, this is where I'd like to make two observations. First, as to Europe. The only thing the way I don't understand European nationalists, I don't understand the anti-integration declarations. Because today, Europe, not for the last 20 years, but even much longer, has come very close to acknowledging their unity and their sameness. The Europeans from Greece to Ireland, I can't say they're the same nation, but they're people who are very similar cultural traditions. If they come together, if united, this would make up a field for a huge liberal experiment. What is wrong about it and what can be opposed to it, I really do not know. I perfectly realize that much more high danger for Europe is the migration wave that is happening from beyond its boundaries. This is actually what the European politicians object to. But in my view, to overcome or to put some limitations to this migration wave can be done only if you create a strong and united Europe and one Europe. Trying to divide Europe again into parts, in my view, this is disastrously dangerous choice, which will lead to a global catastrophe for the Western world as a whole. But despite all that, pan-European nationalists, I do not see them almost, which in my view is strange. Again, I would like to say again, and the key that in my view, it is particularly once the European nations in the 1950s, 1960s, it opened up opportunities for liberalism and democratic coalitions in those societies to mature. If back in the 19th century Europe had adopted multiculturalism in the today's sense of the word, I suspect that modern democracy wouldn't have arisen there. As to Russia, here I suppose there would be many questions. We can see this discussion taking place at the political level, which is going on very actively. All kinds of political forces in Russia and all participants in the social and public discussions. I suppose in Russia, the idea of the Russian world in itself is reasonable, but the way they executed it was a disaster. Disastrously normal. In this sense, I completely am convinced that Russia should have given Russian citizenship to all those who have Russian background. For example, can be done in Italy. If you prove that you have a relative who had lived in Italy back down to the 18th century, you can obtain an Italian passport no matter where you live. Moreover, I suppose we should cancel all the limitations on dual citizenship, on discrimination of the Russian citizens in terms of the way they admitted to the Russian service and in terms of dual citizenship and residence permit and whatever. This is where actually what could be called positively the Russian world, that would have been a huge Russia with a huge diaspora and whose opinion would have been considered. Today, and I've been writing about this, there are two Russian worlds. First, the Russian world that is made up of successful Russians who went abroad at different times for a variety of reasons, left the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the new Russia, that pretty successfully fitted into the competitive Western other societies and achieved a lot there. Today, people who hail from the Soviet Union, they control much bigger share economically than the economy of Russia. So this is surely the potential that should be borne in mind and should be taken into account. And you can't think that they are somebody like we no longer care of. But on the other hand, there is a Russian world that remained in the former Soviet Union after its collapse. And in this sense, the people who never returned to Russia never fitted into the societies where they remained or had to remain if they'd remained on purpose. We have seen huge immigration into Russia. those who remained are those who either had made their deliberate, conscientious choice, or were reluctant, or were unable for a number of reasons. They are part of the population that deserve maybe some kind of certain attitude, but at least we should not be guided by them in any way. Nevertheless, we should not seek in any way, by politically, geopolitical, in a military way, to support this part of the society and destabilize our relations with our near abroad, based upon the interests as the Kremlin seeks to do. It's counterproductory. We are basically saying no to the global Russian society that may help Russia move ahead and which is the carrier of the most reasonable and advanced notions in favor of those who cannot do anything. In this way, we're trying to look back into this way or other. What I want to say is that several dangerous trends. One of them is that certain national traditions and national societies indeed are under, first, an external threat, and the second one is predetermined by the doctrine of human rights, which I think has nothing to do so far, before it has begun to seriously destroy the societies as I suppose, which came up with today's understanding of liberalism and democracy. In this sense, the ideas of freedoms and rights and societies that set up these countries where there's legal freedom and poses no threat, and no threat can be justified, no philosophical ideas. Indeed, today there is a problem of correlation between liberalism, democracy, and those structures where they have arisen. The very fact that there is tension between them, tension which in my view they seek to either, let me put it this way, claim that it just doesn't exist, or seeks to address it in other ways. I suppose it's very dangerous and may provoke a lot of concern. It causes a lot of concern. In point of fact, again, within national societies, they gave rise to modern liberalism and democracy. And the very fact that between these three something fundamental for the Western world categories, we're seeing this sort of tension, which we're seeing today, this is a very bad and disturbing sign for the Western world. Thank you.